Well, a very warm welcome to everyone who's joining us this evening to discuss global human security, cooperation, common security and the climate at this, which is our second webinar in our Reclaiming Security series of webinars that are happening over the winter. For those of you not familiar with Rethinking Security and its members, we work for approaches to security that are based on sustainability, inclusion, equality and justice. And this series of webinars will take us up to the launch of our human security strategy for the UK, which is a culmination of our 3-year research project, the Alternative Security Review. When we began this review, we could not have foreseen where the world would be now, with millions more people suffering the horrendous and devastating effects of war, as well as the ongoing problems associated with the impacts of climate breakdown. And I'm sure many of you are watching while governments negotiate on potential climate action this week at COP28. We're privileged tonight to have with us some amazing activist experts to discuss global human security. All of our speakers work in different fields in international relations, all working for security based on cooperation and an understanding of the limits of the planet that we inhabit, as well as the limits of the current international approach to security. So welcome to Beatriz, Elizabeth, Tariq and Nick. Each of them will introduce some of the big issues we face to build global human security, from international negotiations to peace building on the ground, climate justice and feminist approaches to security. We're exploring tonight whether a cooperative approach to human and planetary security can be achieved internationally, and what the dangers are with our current militarized approaches to security if this is not achieved and fast. After the speakers' contributions, there'll be plenty of time for questions and discussion. We're in webinar mode on Zoom, so please use the Q&A box for your questions at any time. And then when we come to the discussion time, I'll take us through all of your questions. And sorry about my cough. So I'm not going to say any more other than introduce the speakers, and I'll introduce each speaker in turn before they speak. So first of all, we have Elizabeth. Elizabeth Miner is an advisor at Article 36, a UK-based NGO that works for international policies and legal standards to prohibit and restrict different weapons in order to protect civilians. She currently focuses on the issues of nuclear weapons and increasing autonomy in weapons systems. Article 36 works in global coalitions, including the Nobel Prize-winning International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN. And Elizabeth was part of the ICAN team at the negotiation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in 2017. And she's just returned from the treaty's second meeting of state parties. So Elizabeth, thank you for joining us tonight. With the experience of that second meeting of the TPNW state parties in mind, what can those kind of processes that you've been part of tell us about the possibility of achieving common security or human security? Do you think it's possible? What are the issues that we face? So over to you, and I'll just make sure that you're the main speaker. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Jo, and thanks for the introduction, and yeah, thanks very much for having me on this great webinar. So just as an introduction to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, for those who haven't heard of it maybe or are less familiar, basically this is an initiative that came out of the fact that nuclear disarmament for decades has been kind of deadlocked and also captured by the nuclear armed states in terms of blocking the action kind of going forward. In that context, there was a humanitarian initiative on nuclear weapons, which aimed to reframe nuclear weapons in the international policy discourse, kind of away from ideas about national security and ideas of deterrence and onto the facts about what nuclear weapons do to people and places. So onto the catastrophic humanitarian and environmental consequences of nuclear weapons, and also the huge risks that they pose at the moment, to humanity and all the time in ways that maybe aren't so appreciated after the Cold War, but the risk is definitely there and very real. And the idea was to take this discussion internationally on nuclear weapons beyond the considerations of the nuclear armed states, between themselves and their ideas of their security, to frame this as a problem which is, for all humanity, and which all states and other stakeholders have a stake and also have some agency to do something about it. So many of these ideas are not necessarily new in the nuclear disarmament movement, but the kind of new idea was to take kind of examples and experience from previous humanitarian disarmament treaties, so initiatives to prohibit other weapons such as anti-personnel landmines and cluster munitions, and to draw a legal line, so kind of comprehensively prohibit nuclear weapons, drawing that line in international law, and whether the nuclear armed states initially participated in these negotiations or not. And the idea is that by concluding such a treaty, through this, we can kind of change norms, we can change meaning around nuclear weapons, we can erode their legitimacy as tools in international relations by kind of building stigma against them. And through this, we can help create the kind of international political pressure and shift that is needed for actual disarmament. So that's the background, that's the pitch of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Developing the idea of this treaty, banning without the nuclear armed states, focusing on humanitarian and more of a human security lens in relation to nuclear weapons. This was kind of a collaborative process and idea that was developed between people from certain states who were interested in, making progress in this area, people from civil society, and also from international organizations, and especially, a few individuals who had worked on previous processes to prohibit certain weapon systems and wanted to use the lessons on ways of working and generating change to apply these to nuclear weapons. So especially the process to get the Convention on Cluster Munitions, which had been concluded in 2008, and where there was a really kind of quite strong partnership between states and civil society to develop that treaty. There was an idea of what more can we do with this kind of approach. So I guess one thing to note, apart from that kind of basis of collaboration, which is maybe a kind of, useful example if we can, push forward those kind of ways of working, is the, the humanitarian initiative on nuclear weapons, the whole process around that, and the TPNW negotiations themselves. An important aspect of those was kind of the presence of survivors of nuclear use in Japan, and also of survivors of communities affected by nuclear testing, and their testimony about the effects, the real effects of nuclear weapons on communities. And this was kind of a key piece of evidence, I think, in the initiative and in the negotiation. And because the impacts of nuclear weapons aren't just theoretical about the future or in the past, but affected communities are also still pushing for justice around the impacts of radioactive contamination now. Something that we pushed for during the negotiations as well was provisions to reflect that. So a new kind of framework of responsibility from states that join the treaty to address the ongoing humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons and nuclear legacies, which is in Articles 6 and 7 of the treaty. Since then, I guess thinking about kind of inclusion and collaborative ways of working, one thing that's been important to us and to ICANN is to kind of build inclusivity beyond, survivors being called for their testimony, to real kind of inclusion in policy making and the implementation of these articles, which are meant to be kind of, beneficial to affected communities. Making that meaningful, centering affected communities in these provisions on victim assistance and environmental remediation, which oblige states to respond to the ongoing legacies of nuclear weapons, is a job that we're looking at, and I suppose needs further progress in coming years. We've seen some progress there, like attempts within civil society to widen our networks and involve more people in a kind of more collaborative and meaningful way, and from states to also invite kind of contributions and expert presentations from affected communities in the work they've been doing between meetings of states parties internationally and also at those meetings. But there's also challenges there in terms of both states and civil society's efforts, and I guess there's a long way to go for kind of true inclusivity and accessibility, and which are principles that states have committed to in this area. So we just had the second meeting of States Party, as Joe mentioned. In terms of outcome there, we did have a political declaration come out of the conference. There was some strong stuff in there on nuclear deterrence, where states parties have kind of mandated themselves with other stakeholders to challenge the security paradigm based on nuclear deterrence by highlighting and promoting new scientific evidence about humanitarian consequences. So they're, carrying on this theme of continuing to try and reframe nuclear weapons as a human security issue, and to do serious work there. I guess in terms of just a couple of takeaways with the theme of the webinar tonight, I suppose from participating in the process on the TPNW, both in its negotiation and the work since to try and establish the implementation of this framework and for it to make an impact in the international sphere, I'd say that it shows that we can build initiatives involving collaboration between a range of different actors to kind of do stuff together, frame things in a humanitarian and human security terms, and to make an impact on the international landscape through these tools and framings. Obviously, the TPNW is young and has a way to go, but I think states internationally are increasingly forced to engage with its existence, with its humanitarian basis. One interesting development recently was that there was a first committee of the UN General Assembly's resolution on addressing nuclear legacies, where a wide range of nuclear umbrella states also voted in favour of a text that acknowledges the TPNW's provisions on victim assistance and also encourages greater engagement on these issues, which I think is one example showing the kind of spreading of these norms and a kind of chink in the armour of the edifice here. Building inclusive ways of working is kind of a constant and ongoing task and a challenge, including with states and particularly in bringing in sort of more marginalized voices. But I feel like we've got some good footholds there and some good examples of ways of working going forward. So I'll leave it there. That was probably a lot of information.
That was great, thank you. It's really helpful to hear that difference between the sort of concrete, the positive concrete developments based on humanitarian issues and witness testimonies versus the kind of the progress made on challenging an abstract narrative that can be quite damaging. So it's really great to see those how those things work together. So I'm going to move on now. Thank you, Elizabeth, to hear from Nick. Nick Buxton is the Knowledge Hub Coordinator at the Transnational Institute. It's an international research organisation based in the Netherlands, and he oversees TNI's work on emerging issues such as digitalisation, and also does research on border politics, climate change, militarism and economic justice. Nick was co-editor of the influential book, The Secure and the Dispossessed, How the Military and Corporations Are Seeking to Shape a Climate-Changed World. The book explored military plans for climate breakdown. And I have read that, and it's a very illuminating and very concerning read. So I do recommend it. As a dual US and UK citizen, Nick is currently based in California, but has also lived for a number of years in the UK, Bolivia, Pakistan, and India. So Nick, it'd be great to hear from you really about when it comes to climate breakdown or climate change, what are those dangers with this kind of business as usual approach to foreign and security policy? Are there ways that you see things changing, as Elizabeth has seen with the TPNW? So over to you to hear about this other big threat to our human security that we face.
Yeah, thank you, Joanna. And thank you for organising this session and this series. I really think that the work that Rethinking Security do is so critical right now, and bringing together people from different experiences and different contexts, and having these conversations is really valuable in itself. So thank you so much for organising this. I think it's really suitable that we're having this conversation both in the middle of COP and also amidst the horrors of what's happening in Gaza, because I think they're both very illustrative about about the crises that we're facing and what does collective security really look like right now. In terms of COP, I've been a long time kind of working on climate change and climate activism and have been to many of these COPs. I'm not at this one, but I think we all know from that experience, that they are not delivering a deal that climate say is needed. The fact that we're at the 28th COP and still they haven't actually reduced emissions or met some of their commitments that they made back in 2009 to raise 100 billion years in climate finance, just shows that this model is clearly not working. Everyone can see what's happening with our own eyes increasingly in terms of climate impacts, and yet emissions haven't even started to fall. And what the IPCC says is, in fact, they reached their highest rate ever this year. And the IPCC says that we have to reduce those emissions by 43% by 2030. That's just 7 years away. And what was the response to the international community this year in terms of this really impending crisis and also a need for urgent action? It was to ask the climate negotiations to be hosted by a petrostate and chaired by a head of an oil company who has openly said that the science doesn't back phasing out fossil fuels. I mean, it's so perverse. I mean, contrary, it's really quite hard to any rational sense, it's quite hard to even fathom that this is happening. And so that's one of the contexts for this conversation that I think is very illustrative. I think the other is what we're witnessing in Gaza right now. And because to me, that is perhaps the most extreme version of a foreign security policy built around this concept that security can only be delivered at the end of a bunker busting bomb, or a separation war built on exclusion, or a surveillance state that seeks to control even the calories of its occupied populations. We might think that what's happening right now is extreme, but it is seen, but the practice is seen as a model by many countries for their security plans and infrastructure. So Israel's military expertise is contracted right now by many European research projects. Its surveillance technologies are brought worldwide. So, for example, some of its drones are used by Frontex, the main border guard agency in Europe. Its police are invited to train police worldwide, and it's become a significant security player in global markets. In fact, Israel markets itself as being valuable because its technologies are battle tested. In other words, tested on an occupied population. So I think both these stories of what's happening in COP28 and what's happening right now in Gaza show the real dangers of a business as usual approach to foreign and security policy. And they're microcosms of a much bigger systemic failure, one in which military spending, for example, has more than doubled since the end of the Cold War. And we've seen some of the results now in terms of not just the wars that we're seeing in Gaza and Ukraine, but also new levels of geopolitical tensions and talk of a new Cold War or new hot wars between the major powers. We're seeing it in terms of the way that finances and spending is going vastly towards military. And this is something TNI has done some recent reports on. We did a report looking at, for example, a couple of years ago, how much money was going towards building militarized walls compared to climate finance. And it was the richest countries are spending 2.5 times as much on building and militarizing walls compared to climate finance. And when you compare that to the military, we find that the richest countries are spending 30 times as much. And so there's a huge diversion of resources that are going on responding in a militarized fashion to crises that we're facing. And alongside this, and it's intertwined with it, is this whole rise in fear-based politics, racism, authoritarianism. That's obsessed with security responses to every social and environmental crisis, and which is more and more shaping both governments coming to power. We've had the rise of the far right in the Netherlands recently, in Argentina, and by implication, it also impacts on the foreign policy priorities. So I think it's quite clear that this big picture is that we're going very much in the opposite direction of what everyone on this call is trying to forge, which is a more human and planet-centered version of security. So I think one of the things I want to suggest in this just brief presentation is that we need to look at some of the reasons why this has happened, because if we don't look at the underlying reasons, we won't be able to come up with effective strategies to kind of change direction. And I think one of the reasons is that we have had two doctrines that become very hegemonic in the last 2 decades. And they're doctrines that reinforce each other. The first doctrine is one we're familiar with, of neoliberalism, which in rough terms and very shortly is the idea that economy and society is best run by unleashing the power of corporations, by cutting regulations, increasing financialization, opening up as many sectors of the economy as possible, and cutting back on the social and welfare components of the state. And this doctrine, of course, kind of emerged particularly strongly in the 80s and remains dominant today, and has led to the emergence of really a corporate state where corporations have unprecedented control and influence over public policy nationally, regionally, and internationally. And it's effectively meant that states have been unable to, or just won't take the necessary interventionist measures to bring about a radical and just transition of the economy. To reduce emissions by 43% in 7 years can only be done through a kind of planned descent, and no countries are willing to take that kind of control. And the second doctrine is one around militarism and securitization, which really argues that security needs massive investment in the military, intelligence, and policing. And that really any concerns that we might have, whether this is about the concerns about privacy, whether it's about new wars, whether it's about repression of expression and protests that have supposedly defined liberal societies, well, those concerns need to be put aside because security matters above all. And of course, this ideology received a huge boost during the war on terror, which then created the infrastructure of an increasingly militarized and security state. And then that same infrastructure is now being deployed on migrants, activists. So you've got the war on migration, you've got the war on eco-extremists that we see very strongly in the UK at the moment. And I think it's also ready to be deployed against the victims of change. We see increasingly in national security strategies that the victims of climate change are being called threat multipliers. And so the reason why we need military again is to respond to the consequences of climate change. And these two doctrines are hegemonic. They dominate policy, they dominate academia, media, popular culture, and they also reinforce each other. So neoliberalism, for example, has massively empowered the arms industry and security firms and given them a huge influence and power. It's also removed much of the social welfare state that supported vulnerable people, which has led to the rise of the right. The rise of Brexit is a clear example that came in the wake of unprecedented austerity in the UK. And it showed how racism and this kind of fear-based politics that drives security can thrive in a vacuum of social support and solidarity. And the rise of Wilders in the Netherlands comes in a very similar context. So just to finish, I think, just some initial suggestions, and I think also Elizabeth shared another model for action that I just perhaps tack on the end. I want to just suggest 3 clear avenues for action, because I don't think we're going to see the answers to this within COP28. So we need to kind of look elsewhere. It can be a place for struggle, but it's not going to be the place where we will find solutions. So I first think we need to acknowledge the systemic nature of this. The ways that neoliberalism and militarization intertwine. So we need to take on the system and not just the surface reflections of it. The second is that we need to look at the key actors. They are corporations that uphold the system. In the case of climate change, of course, it's big oil, but it's also the arms trade. And we're talking about 20 to 30 firms that really uphold the majority of the system. We've been looking at the same key ones who are winning contracts right now in Gaza are also the same ones who are getting many of the border security contracts, both for the European Union and the US. So we're talking about really a border military security industrial complex. And we really need to make them the villains of this piece and direct the anger at them rather than the victims that most politicians prefer to villainize, such as migrants. And the third thing is we need to carve out alternative models and practices. I think the advantage we have on our side is that these doctrines of neoliberalism and militarism ultimately don't work because they treat consequences rather than causes. So they will never tackle it. And we see that very clearly in Gaza. this militarized response is not going to create, we all know it's not going to create peace and security in Israel or Palestine. So we need to find the alternatives. And we can create those alternatives at local, national, regional levels, built around different principles, and show how they work and are a better way forward to address the systemic causes. And I think also the experiences of the TPNW is a good way of showing how civil society can also interact with governments in the South, outside some of the major powers, and create new alliances of cooperation and collaboration. I just wanted to end really, because I know this area is it can be a really tough area to work with, especially right now. It's quite easy to become depressed or disheartened. So I just want to end with a quote by a former T&I fellow who is also an author and activist and a playwright, John Berger, who wrote, "Hope is not a form of guarantee, it's a form of energy. And very frequently, that energy is strongest in circumstances that are very dark."
Thank you very much, Nick. That's a really great quote to end on, bringing the way that you've brought together these different systemic issues, and because it can feel overwhelming to take action on them. But yeah, that's an excellent quote. So next we have Tahir Aziz. He is joining us tonight, bringing extensive experience of providing strategic direction with Conciliation resources in South Asia for 15+ years. He was involved in establishing and facilitating the Track 1.5 Sula dialogue process, and he has extensive networks and relations with senior stakeholders in Pakistan and India, and has built constructive relationships to take forward several thematic areas of confidence building. He maintains working relationships with civil society and has sensitively championed gender and human rights within the peace-building approaches in the region. He's an experienced leader and peace-building practitioner and a recent fellow at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. And prior to his work with Conciliation Resources, Tahir held roles at the International Centre for Religion and Diplomacy and the Human Rights Commission of the Government of Azad, Jammu and Kashmir. So, Tahir, welcome to you. Conciliation Resources recently released a report about the impacts of climate breakdown on peace building. So it'd be really great to hear more from you about your work, how these big issues in the international system and climate breakdown, how that works on the ground in your peace building work, and what suggestions and knowledge you bring to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna. It's a privilege to be part of this webinar. Let me endorse the premise of your question that you posed to me, and it says the militarized approach to security and climate breakdown already is affecting too many communities on the ground. I would respond to the suggestions and lesson side of things from the context of Kashmir, which was part of one context that the report that you mentioned, Conciliation Resources, did recently. And Kashmir is also a context where Conciliation Resources has spent quite a number of years supporting peace building activities across both sides of the line of control. And is a context where we see how militarized approach to climate change is having negative and mutually reinforcing impacts on the conflict itself, but also on the environment and on gender and social inequality, all of which, as we know, interact with each other. So, but for those of us who are in this webinar who might not be very familiar with the context of Kashmir, let me give a brief introduction or brief description of what the conflict is about. Of course, it can't be defined comprehensively, but for just reference point, the conflict in and around Kashmir can be, I think the origins can be found in the partition of India and Pakistan becoming two nation states, And Jammu and Kashmir, which is the full name of the Kashmir region, was one of the princely states that also became entangled in the fight between India and Pakistan to claim both of them, each of them claimed and still claims the entire Jammu and Kashmir state, which was a semi-autonomous independent state at that point, and had complex history in terms of its population as well as the rulers, and also did not fit very neatly in the partition plan. 75 years have passed. This was 1947. We still see that struggle and fight between the state of India and state of Pakistan to claim the whole territory, but also the populations within the regions of Jammu and Kashmir, who come from very diverse backgrounds, religious, ethnic, linguistic, and other backgrounds, also politically have different viewpoints. But primarily, I think there is an inherent struggle to protect their own distinctive identity. And so this is a whole, these different viewpoints are clashing in Kashmir, and there is a line of control that is that divides it into Indian administered and Pakistani administered Kashmirs. Now back to the militarized approaches. We see in Kashmir that these militarized approaches to conflict and to security are also, becoming similar in the response to climate change. And what they are doing is they are exacerbating both the grievances as well as the conflict resolution. Conflict itself gets very much exacerbated by the same approach. Security is defined by both sides of the line of control, that is India and Pakistan, as in relation to rivalry to each other. And similarly, the competition over natural resources and environmental issues now is also taken in the same light. It's also defined as in opposition to each other. The preference of militarized approaches also combines with climate change, new threats of climate change, to pose real risks to the communities that are, mainly when they are living living close to the line of control. One example is that the explosive devices that are many in the region, they move due to the climate change and a lot of floodings and rains and landslides to the populated areas, and there is already massive loss of life and loss of limbs and through those devices. But the approach primarily is that those are there for the security and protection of and maintaining the border. And then also there are instances of people, because of climate change, there is pressure on the communities who look for, who herd and keep livestock. They are forced to look for grazing elsewhere, and what it does is sometimes they cross the line of control, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, but the consequence is that they're caught and there are they get sort of framed as infiltrators, and then the whole tension reinforces and across the line of control. Militarization also prevents, in our experience, from collaboration on the environmental issues. Kashmir, as I said, is a long-standing issue, but it's also one of probably the most militarized contexts in the world. And so a lot of landmines, a lot of military hardware in the region that is, like I mentioned earlier, damaging infrastructure, and also sort of there is a cycle of inability to respond to it, which is damaging the fragile ecosystems in the region. But perhaps the most important thing is that it's it's preventing so far for a kind of although the need on both sides and the benefit of collaborating on mitigating the climate change impacts are there, and there are issues already defined between the two countries, like there is a treaty on the waters distribution, Indus Waters Treaty, which was signed in 1960. It still is intact. There are some conversations going on, but the language and the approach, because it's primarily takes its source from the militarized approach, it's very combative. It's very assertive and very less compromising. And the third thing that we noticed, which comes out in this report, is that this masculine militarized approach to climate change is having destructive effects on gender and social inequality, which is the fundamental root cause of most of the problems. And for example, in this report workshop, the participants flagged that climate change reinforces the gender roles and closes spaces for alternative perspectives. Climate change is often interpreted as a significant force of nature, requiring adoption of survival mode responses which amplify the masculine and amascular traits such as protectionism, strength, physical labor, for example, in training men to rebuild houses, to regain cattle, and prioritizing sharp and quick decision-making led by men. So we see a reinforcement of the gender norms and the traditional gender roles. Militarized and masculine approach to security and climate change leave little space for meaningful acceptance of women, particularly, or other marginalized groups in decision making. With those who are included somehow, they have to, they kind of are forced to compensate by legitimizing the masculine. So those take part, they are already like, under pressure in a way to accept the norm, which is also a consequence of the same thing. And so one of the kind of surveys, for example, of our partner organization did with the women living through the line of control, and disaster in Kashmir is a massive ongoing issue, and now it's linked with climate change. It's massively destructive, and most of the time communities have to rely on their own skills. And one of the things that partners found was in that survey was the women who were mostly affected and needed the training, they could not get the access to training because of the gender norm. So it wasn't allowed them to take part. But when it came to the effects of a disaster, the women were, particularly the women, the widowed and divorced women were more vulnerable than anybody else. And in terms of their food insecurity and damage to agricultural equipment and limitations to trade movement. Now, moving on to the lessons that out of this context can be relevant globally. And I think there are in our work, and we have experienced that there are opportunities, initiatives, and approaches that peace builders, climate specialists, governments, and financial institutions can take inspiration from. So, number one, I think based on this work, based on our experience where things can change a little bit, and I think one thing we noticed is that We need to embrace, fund, and share inclusive intersectional analysis of conflict to better inform climate-related interventions. To develop responses to climate change that will support peace building, gender equality, and be more effective and sustainable, we need to ground interventions in good analysis of gender and conflict dynamics. But this is, as we know, is the exception rather than the norm. Such analysis should be participatory, pulling together individuals with wide-ranging experiences and expertise of conflict, climate change, and gender equality. Only then can we get a full picture of how the various expectations, relations to power dynamics, and people experience the dynamics that people experience shape responses to climate change at household, community, and global levels. This is necessary for if climate change initiatives are to identify and meet diverse community priorities, where influencing different actors' response strategies is a way that is coordinated but also culturally sensitive. Secondly, we need to adapt climate interventions to address underlying and overlapping causes of climate change, conflict, and inequality. Many of the drivers of climate change, conflict, and inequality overlap. This and center around imbalance of power, unequal access to decision making, and extractive approaches to managing land, people, and resources. Peace builders have a key role to play in supporting climate practitioners to understand the underlying drivers of inequality and fragility, and identifying methods for shifting these through locally defined approaches and expertise, creating safe spaces for confidence building between communities and those in position of power, and supporting authorities to facilitate more meaningful participation of marginalized groups in climate response. This means working with peace builders and social protection initiatives to support and include marginalized people and communities through climate initiatives, ensuring that they have what they need to combat climate change effectively while exchanging indigenous cultural technical knowledge to inform approaches. And finally, we learned that promoting dialogue as well as collaboration between communities and sectors as part of climate response is a fundamentally important thing. Climate change, as we know, does not respect borders. Effective responses to it also then demand collaboration within and between communities, and even between countries, as we learn in the case of Kashmir. Peace builders are well placed to facilitate dialogues between conflict parties on transboundary natural resource issues, promote inclusive and climate resilient governance and livelihood models, and de-escalate tensions directly linked to the environment. At the same time, they can open up safe spaces to reflect on and redefine more restrictive norms, gender norms that pressure young men, for example, to engage in high-risk violent coping strategies or limit women's agency in climate crisis. I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tahir. That was really interesting to hear, not only how you have highlighted the impacts of the systemic issues that Nick shared with us, but also the very real and concrete steps that can be taken and are being taken in some cases to change this idea and understanding of security, particularly in the face of climate change and the dangers that militarism poses to many communities because of that. So thank you very much for that. And we're now going to move on to Beatriz, who's our final contributor this evening. Beatriz Arnal Calvo is a feminist, pacifist and environmentalist activist researcher. She's a doctoral candidate at the University of Brighton with a thesis around the intersections of gender, conflict, militarism, climate and peace. She's a member of the executive committee of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in both the UK and Spain. And she's also a researcher at the Peace Research Seminar in Spain, where she looks at environmental and climate crises from a multidisciplinary angle, drawing on environmental humanities, climate ethics and politics and feminist peace research. And she also has extensive experience as an aid worker in settings of armed conflict and forced displacement. So Beatriz, WILPF advocate a feminist approach to peace and security, some of which we have heard about from Tahir, well, a gender sensitive approach to peace and security. And I'd love to hear from you what feminism can teach us about building common and human security into an international system as well as on the ground, especially when it comes to dealing with the climate emergency. So over to you, thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Can everybody hear me and see me well? Yes? Okay, perfect. Thank you very much to Rethinking Security for inviting me to participate in this webinar on behalf of WILPF UK. I'm going to refer to gender as another structure of power that intersects with the climate crisis, as well as with war and militarism. I have divided my presentation into two parts. First, I will explain why war, militarism, security, the climate crisis, and peace, and also the various ways they overlap, have multiple gender dimensions, and therefore they are all feminist issues. And second, I will talk about how WILPF practices feminist pacifism around war, militarism, security, climate and peace research, actions, and policies. So let's start with the gender dimensions of war, militarism, security, the climate crisis, and peace, and why they are all feminist issues. We have seen today how war, militarism, security, the climate crisis, and peace are interconnected and overlap in various ways. Moreover, they all have gender dimensions. Women and girls across the sexual orientation and gender diversity spectrum and other marginalized communities like Black and Brown people, Indigenous people, low-income people, and people from the Global South, among other categories, experience armed conflict and war differently and disproportionately, given their already marginalized position in society. The climate crisis also impacts women and girls and other marginalized people differently and disproportionately, even though they are the ones who have contributed the least to the climate emergency, and many times the ones that are in the front lines of protecting endangered ecosystems. Yet environmental defenders, most of which are women, are harassed, attacked, persecuted, and forcibly disappear and even murdered, many times at the hands of the militaries. In addition, climate change exacerbates underlying forms of violence and insecurity based on markers of discrimination such as gender, race, ethnicity, age, or ability. So then the people who are in a most vulnerable position to suffer the worst consequences of climate insecurity are women and people from the aforementioned marginalized communities. Further, as we see before, sexual and gender-based violence rates drastically increase during military interventions, as well as during environmental disasters, especially when there are small and light weapons at home. But beyond direct impacts on women and girls and other marginalized communities, war, militarism, security, the climate crisis, and peace have other gender dimensions. Military activities and war are grounded on and perpetuate rigid gender norms and expectations, and they normalize a profoundly gendered culture of violence. Further, the militaries are largely male-dominated, and the global arms trade profits mostly white men from the global north. Also, women and girls are absent or underrepresented in both peace negotiations and in climate policies and programs, which are again mostly male-dominated. And in the rare occasions they are represented, in both cases they are mostly represented as victims, especially Black women, Indigenous women, and women from the Global South, rather than as agents of change with agency and expertise on both peace building and climate action. Finally, the growing domination of both peace building and climate research by the militaries also diverts funds from civil society-led peace, security, and climate research, particularly critical analysis and interventions such as feminist, environmentalist, and pacifist approaches that put emphasis on intersectionality, common but differentiated responsibilities, cooperation, ethics of care, interdependency, and reciprocity, rather than on the largely normalized, militarized ethics and aesthetics of violence and aggression. That was my first point, and we will now discuss point 2, how WILPF practices feminist pacifism around war, militarism, security, climate, and peace research, actions, and policies. Let me first of all introduce WILPF for those who don't know it yet. WILPF stands for the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the oldest feminist pacifist organization in the world, working since the First World War. WILPF has national sections in 37 countries across 5 continents, and has various thematic work areas such as women's rights and other human rights, disarmament, ecological justice, feminist political economy, and women, peace and security. At international level, WILPF International has a very active and ever-growing environment working group, which collaborates with the Women and Gender Constituency, one of the 9 constituencies under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Precisely this year, and as a consequence of WILPF's participation at COP27, WILPF launched the Demilitarization Working Group within the Women and Gender Constituency. For the second consecutive year, WILPF sent a delegation to COP28 to amplify our feminist pacifist voices. WILPF was crucial in the making of both the Non-Proliferation Nuclear Weapons Treaty and the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons Treaty. So it said, campaigning for the endorsement of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. At national level, WILPF UK has 4 permanent campaigns around climate justice, human rights, disarmament, and the women, peace and security agenda. We work in partnership with other organizations, like the national section of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots Coalition, the Gender and Development Network, and the Gender Action for Peace and Security. For instance, with the occasion of the launch of the new National Action Plan on the Women, Peace and Security agenda by the UK government last year, WILPF UK, with other allies, advocated for the inclusion of climate security and justice, migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers' rights, and a domestic focus to this national action plan. To sum up, WILPF exemplifies what a feminist pacifist perspective looks like in practice, and what we can learn from a feminist pacifist approach to the climate emergency. First, inclusive and integrated gender analysis of the root and interconnected causes of war, militarism, insecurity, and the climate emergency. Second, a commitment to intersectionality and all forms of justice, like gender and climate justice. And third, an active engagement in building alliances and collaborations worldwide at multiple levels in order to advance towards gender's just and sustainable, peaceful futures. I would like to finalize by bringing 2 important ideas that very nicely represents WILPF's vision. The first one is over here. Probably you've seen it already. We need demilitarization if we truly want to achieve gender and climate justice. The second one is a very powerful quote by Cora Bass and encapsulates the ultimate feminist pacifist aim. We must not make war safe for women. It is time to abolish war. End of the quote. Let me add, it is also time to end the genocide in Gaza for ecological, gender, and humanitarian reasons. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatriz, for that contribution. It's really great to hear more about the work that WILPF does, and to really leave us in no doubt that intersectional approach and analysis, from the way that you have described it, but also from the work that Tahir is doing, and the work that Elizabeth is doing, and the way that Nick described the systems, that intersectional approach is key to building human security within the international system. And I'm very aware that we don't have long left. So what I'd like to do now actually is just give there's been a couple of questions on similar themes. One from Kazuko Hikawa and one from Paul Ingram, which I think really, they ask a very pertinent question about doing this work within the international system, where states can't persuade other states to do, we can't, within the international system, states can't really force other states to do different things. And Paul said something about how do we deal with the bully? How do we deal with those states that just won't engage in this kind of work? So I'm going to ask each of you if you have, I guess, top tips on that, thoughts on that, and any positive actions that we can take as campaigners and activists. Probably most of us are within the UK, to try and put that pressure on. If that's all right, I think you've got about 1 minute each before we have to end. So maybe we'll go in the order that you've spoken. So Elizabeth, Nick, Tahir, then Beatriz.
Okay, big question for 1 minute, but I'll try.
Yeah.
I suppose what I immediately thought was, we're talking about cooperation tonight and cooperative approaches, but also I think that, we create change through tension as well, right? So we create change through both of those. And in Paul's question of, are we advocating for revolution, essentially? I mean, I suppose from my perspective, I think we are, right? So as Nick was mentioning, we need to be taking on systems, not tinkering around the edges here. That's true, I think, with respect to nuclear weapons as much as it is with climate. We need to be challenging these whole systems of power and their narratives rather than engaging with them on their own terms, right? We need to be shifting it onto our territory and engaging there. So that's what I'd say about that, possibly aggressive.
Thank you. It's a good summary. Nick.
Yeah, I've done a lot of my career has kind of been around communication. So it's like thinking how to change the narrative and how to change the story. And so I guess what I just want to contribute, because there's so much to say on this, but I'll just contribute one thing is, I think one of the things I've learned from there is that you root in stuff that is universal values, then you point to the need to then you really kind of identify what the obstacles to that are, and then you say these are the kind of actions we need. And in our case, I think sometimes that would be taking on states and isolating the bully, but I do think, as I shared in my presentation, that we also need to think about the corporations that uphold this, and that provides also the opportunities for transnational organizing. And so if we can kind of identify some of the key actors that uphold a security infrastructure that we don't want, then we can kind of create the alliances that build cross movements, for building climate movements with peace activists with migration justice activists, feminist activists with all of these groups. So I think that would be my suggestion, is that we also need to kind of pin this on a kind of, we need to find ways to build transnational links, and we need to find some of those actors that we can kind of unite our forces around.
Thank you very much. Tahir.
I endorse what's been said before. I think it's a very, very relevant, central, but most difficult question. But my sense is that I think this systemic approach can generate sort of equilibrium between a soft and at times tension, sort of that can create pressure on the bullies and on the actors that are. So climate change in this case is a very sort of unique challenge that we are going through. It opens the kind of the pressures for everybody, because the people who are, irrespective of whether they have contributed or not, we are now seeing that we are all getting affected. And I think that opens the opportunity to fundamentally, I think, challenge the sacrosanct nature of the state or whoever. I think that's where we can, otherwise there are very less opportunities. The system goes back to addressing the sovereignty and keeping that, and that allows people to behave in the way they do. But there is an opportunity here where everybody is getting impacted, and I think it's time to challenge and question that, under sovereignty or under this nature, can people continue to be the exception? Yeah, that's
Thank you. That's I hadn't thought of that, but that's really important. And I want to give Beatriz a chance to answer that as well before we wrap up.
Sure. Well, all the previous answers were really, really good, and I don't think I have much to add, but I do want to emphasize how important it is to think other types of sovereignty, as we just said, beyond the national borders. And that is why it's so important, as Nick was saying, to build transnational networks of solidarity and cooperation, and build alliances that are both intersectional and interdisciplinary. And to the question, are we advocating for a revolution? I am, and I think most feminists are, most pacifists are too, and most ecologists are too, because it is not about a transition. It is really about a transformation of the structures of power, including gender, race, ethnicity, and so on. So yeah, I think we should all transnationally join this revolution to advance towards peaceful futures and more sustainable futures. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all four of you for your contributions. It's been really great. And I'm sure if we could see the audience and hear you, you'd get a very big hand from everyone, because the work that you're doing is really incredible and fills me with hope. So thank you for sharing some of your work and your ideas tonight. It's been really great to hear them. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Yeah, so I don't want to keep anybody longer than you need to be here. But our next webinar is on Wednesday, the 10th of January. So we'll be moving from looking at global human security issues to community security, and looking really, I guess, at this issue of the politics of exclusion, why security policy, so-called security policy in the UK, has excluded so many people from actually feeling secure. So again, we'll have some excellent speakers who are doing brilliant work within the UK to counter that kind of harsh security policy. For example, Prevent, immigration policy, and who are engaged in work around racial justice. So do join us then. You can sign up through our website. And thanks again to our speakers. It's been a real privilege to hear from you, especially at this particular time after the TPNW and during COP, and all the work that you're doing. So thank you again, and good night to everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna.
Bye.
Bye. Good night.
Bye.